All right, guys, welcome back. We are going to do one more piece of our factoring foldable today. So make sure you have out your little factoring foldable, right? We've actually covered all of the types of factoring that we're going to cover in this class. And so now we're moving on to what we call the zero product property. So make sure that, make sure you're on this page of your factoring foldable. So zero product property is just used when you're asked to solve by factoring. So I'm going to kind of underline this and be like, really important, right? So remember that when you're asked to solve, what you're really trying to find are the x-intercepts, right? Where does the graph cross the x-axis? And so we can find where the graph crosses the x-axis by factoring, by using what we call the zero product property. And so you don't have to write this part down. I'm just going to make a note of this. So if I have two things being multiplied together and they equal 0, okay, that tells me that one of these has to be 0, right? Because if neither one of them are 0, when I multiply them together, I'm not going to get 0. So either A has to be 0 or B has to be 0, or both, but at least one of them, okay? That's what we're looking at here in this sense of when we're using zero product property, okay? We're able to solve by setting our equations equal to 0. So our steps here, first step is to get all the terms on the same side of the equation. So that's what we got to do first, okay? Get everything onto one side, set the equation equal to 0. The second step is to factor completely, however whatever that means for the problem, right? There's a lot of different types of factoring. And then you're going to set each term with an x equal to 0 and solve. So you're going to take every parenthesis, every factor that you have come up with, and you're going to set it equal to 0 and solve. So let's look at an example here. I want to solve x squared minus 5x minus 6 equals 0. Okay? And so it wants me to solve, so I actually have to go through all three of these steps. The first thing is to set all terms on the same side of the equation. Well, I've already done that, so neat. I don't have to do anything there. Second step is to factor. So I'm going to take my x squared minus 5x minus 6 equals 0, and we're going to factor it. Okay, now if I go down my list of factoring, right, there's no greatest common factor. There's 3 terms, so I'm not factoring by grouping. It's not a perfect square. It's not a perfect square trinomial because 6 is not a perfect square, right? So I'm just going to have to factor this trinomial. So I'm just looking for 2 numbers that multiply to -6 and add to -5. And so because we're getting so good at factoring, right, I should automatically get x minus 6 and x plus 1, right? -6 and +1 multiply to -6 and they add to -5. Now I have these parentheses. I'm saying something times something equals 0. So now I'm on step 3. So something times something equals 0. Well, if that's the case, then either x minus 6 has to be 0 or x plus 1 has to be 0. Or both, but at least one of them, right? And so now I'm just going to solve for x. So if I add 6, right? X is equal to 6. So there's 1. And minus 1. X is equal to -1. Okay, great. We've solved. Woohoo. What does that mean, right? So what this tells us is that the graph crosses the x-axis, right? That's the x-intercepts. X-intercepts. So the graph crosses the x-axis at the points 6, 0, and -1, 0. That tells me where the graph crosses the x-axis. It tells me where the x-intercepts are. And so now I would be able to solve maybe a little bit easier. Not solve. I would be able to graph it a little bit easier because I at least know 2 points on the graph. Okay, so when we're solving quadratics, what we're solving for are the x-intercepts. Okay, let's look at one more example here, and then we'll be done. Okay, so example 2, I want to solve 3x squared plus x equals 4. It's quadratic, right, because it's x squared. So my first step is I gotta set everything equal to 0. I have to get everything onto one side. I like to keep my x squared positive, so I'm gonna subtract this 4 over, which gives me 3x squared plus x minus 4 equals 0, right? All I did was subtract the 4 over. Then step 2, I need a factor. Okay, so if I go through, there's no greatest common factor. It's not a perfect square. Go down the list, can't factor by grouping, all that kind of stuff. And I come to the conclusion that I have to use x box because my a is 3. Okay, so I'm going to multiply the first term by the last term, which gets me negative 12x squared. And then my middle term goes on the bottom. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 12 and add to 1. So hopefully, right, in our awesomeness, we realize pretty quickly that that's going to be positive 4x and negative 3x. Once I have those numbers, I'm going to come and I'm going to make my box. My 3x squared goes in the top left and my negative 4 goes diagonally from it. And then I'm just going to fill in the other two squares with those two numbers that I found. So I'm going to put my negative 3x here and my 4x here. But it doesn't matter. You can put your 4x here and your negative 3x here. Okay, now I'm going to take the greatest common factor of the top row, which in this case is 3x. I had 3x squared and I took out 3x, so I'm left with 1x. I had negative 3x and I took out 3x, so I'm left with negative 1. Okay, I had 4x, but I took out 1x, so I'm just left with 4. And 4 times negative 1 is negative 4. So we're good. We know we factored that correctly. So in my factored form, I have 3x plus 4 and x minus 1. And this equals 0. Okay? And then the last step is just saying, hey, if these two things multiply to 0, one of them has to be 0. So I can take my 3x plus 4 and set it equal to 0. And I can take my x minus 1 and set it equal to 0. Well, this one should be really quick, right? You just add 1 to the other side. So that one's pretty quick. And then here I'm going to subtract my 4. So I'm left with 3x equal to negative 4. I'm going to divide by 3. So x is equal to negative 4/3. And again, what this has told me is that the graph of this equation crosses the x-axis at negative 4/3 and positive 1. Okay, so negative 4/3 and positive 1. So it just gives me more points on the graph that I can use to graph the final product, or I can use these points for other things as well. Okay, and remember that factoring is just one way that we can solve. We can also use quadratic formula, which we will continue to talk about, or completing the square, which we'll learn about in the next couple of videos. So lots of methods. This is just one of those methods. If you need help, reach out. Otherwise, you got some practice to do, and good luck.